If you're a Range Rover Evoque fan, be warned. The next 6 minutes or so might be a little bit painful. And if you're one of the 50,000 people who have already bought a Porsche Macan, you might well want to stay tuned. Okay, so before I talk about anything else on the new Porsche Macan S Diesel, I just want to show you how refined this new V6 twin-turbo diesel engine is. I'm going to give it absolutely everything in second gear. Listen. That is so smooth. I don't think I've driven a diesel engine that's quieter, more refined, more kind of oiled and lovely feeling than this. And the thing is, it's really quick too. How quick? 255 horsepower, 427 pounds-feet of torque, all of which is attached to and drives via a 7-speed PDK gearbox, which is just lovely in operation. And that lot is right at the heart of this car, and the moment you start to drive it, I mean, there's all sorts of other things that matter, but there's always that lovely drivetrain at the centre of the driving experience, and it really does make the Macan S Diesel a pretty stunning thing to drive right from the word go. The Macan is based loosely on the Audi Q5 in theory, but in reality it's a very different animal to drive. The suspension, steering, gearbox, engine and cabin are all bespoke, and in the case of this S Diesel model, which costs £43,300, the levels of performance and refinement on offer are slightly spooky. They're talking about making 50,000 in the first year, and guess what? They're all sold out. The waiting list for one of these cars is already 1 year long. They cannot build them fast enough. It's unfeasible how much money they're going to make out of these things. I mean, I know this is the diesel engine version, but it is still really sporty. Like, Porsche's central focus on building the Macan was to make the most sporting compact SUV, and not just by a little bit, by a huge margin. The sort of performance we're talking about is 0 to 60 in not much more than 6 seconds and 143 miles an hour flat out. That's proper performance. And yet, at the same time, they reckon it'll do at least 40, if not 45 mpg out there in the real world. I mean, that's a pretty decent combination, considering the emissions are beneath 160 grams. It's a very strong combination. To find out how strong, we're going to compare it with what we think at the moment is our favourite compact SUV, and that of course is the Range Rover Evoque. We took an SD4 Evoque to the Macan's launch in Germany just to see how good Porsche's new junior SUV might compare, and straight away the differences became painfully apparent. Now, it's really interesting. There are 3 things immediately that you notice when you go from the Macan into the Evoque. The first is the engine. Let me show you. I'll just come down to second gear, give it some throttle. One, you don't go forwards at anything like the same rate that you do in the Macan. 2, it doesn't make a very nice noise. I mean, you've got 4 cylinders under there rather than 6, with nowhere near as much power, nowhere near as much torque, a similar kind of weight to lug about, and as a result the poor old Evoque feels pretty undernourished after the Porsche in a straight line. It also has this slight feeling of vaguely unnecessary weight to its controls, particularly the steering. In isolation, this has got really nice steering, I think, or I thought, the Evoque, but the Macan really does show it the way home in terms of steering, and in terms of just its kind of general demeanour, the way it goes down the road. The Range Rover feels a bit cumbersome and a bit heavy after the Porsche, but I guess that's not surprising, because Porsche have tried to make a really sporting SUV, and they've made a really sporting SUV, whereas the Evoque is just kind of fairly happy dynamically to plough the middle ground, and that is how it feels. But the thing is, when you get into the Range Rover after the Porsche, it just feels a bit stodgy, to be honest. See, the Range Rover's great at doing this sort of thing, being off-road. But just like the Macan, I don't believe that many, if any, people who buy an Evoque think, I'm going to go off-roading in it this weekend. No. They go down the shops in it, they go shopping in it, they drive it around in the local high street. Just like the adverts say, they go to the cafe in it. They don't come to forests and drive around in thick mud in them. But again, just like with the Macan, it's nice to know that if you want to, you can. Okay, so let's go back to the Macan and just drive it again, having spent a bit of time in the Range Rover. The thing about the Macan off-road is that, you know, they have thought about it. It's got an off-road button down here which just raises the ride height a bit and puts the transmission and it puts the diffs just in a optimum setting to generate optimum traction when it's a bit sticky and it's a bit muddy. And I mean, you try and drive over something like this in a car, and A, you get stuck, you get ground out immediately, and B, I think you wouldn't have traction. But I mean, this is just no problem at all. Absolutely no problem whatsoever in the Macan. Okay, here are the big differences between the Macan and the Evoque. The Macan is miles faster. Its engine and gearbox are both miles better. It's kind of difficult to tell on these roads because they're pretty smooth, but I've got a feeling that the suspension is more refined in the Porsche too. I think it rides better than the Range Rover. It definitely handles better than the Range Rover. It feels lighter and more agile and less kind of roly-poly when you really start to throw it about. And Porsche do think some of their customers will want to drive Macans properly. That's why it is so fundamentally well sorted. It's slightly more expensive, but not by much. It's a lot nicer to drive, let's face it. Let's be true about it. The Porsche runs rings around the Range Rover dynamically. I really like the cabin inside the new Macan too. It just feels kind of compact, expensive, luxurious. It's got more room in the back of it than the Range Rover as well. That's a key point. There is not much room in the back of the Range Rover, and this thing really highlights that. So are we coming to the conclusion that the Macan beats the Range Rover? I think the answer is yes. It has to. It just does so many things better than the Range Rover in black and white terms that it doesn't really matter overall that I happen to personally think the Range Rover looks better. The Porsche is a really, really good, really well-rounded car, and I'm sure they will sell them by the bucket load, but only because they deserve to, because it's really good.